The Houston Texans find themselves in one of the most unique situations of the entire NFL, having a rookie quarterback who's only making $9 million while also being able to compete for Super Bowls. They're in a situation that every single NFL team would love to be in. So with that all said, let's break down the Houston Texans. And we will begin by actually discussing the season that the Houston Texans just had. And let's be honest, it was a miraculous season that a lot of us did not see coming. They obviously made it all the way to the divisional round of the playoffs where they got a little bit beaten up by the Baltimore Ravens, but there's no shame in that. They are a damn good team. But the positives that came from the season are immense. For starters, CJ Stroud, Tank Dell, and Will Anderson all lived up to expectations, and they look like they're going to be cornerstones for this franchise moving forward. This team also had amazing contributions from guys like Dalton Schultz, Nico Collins, Devin Singletary, and a ton of these defensive players like Jonathan Grenard and Blake Cashman. And with a team that's already pretty established and good enough to compete for championships, this team is in a pretty fun spot. Rookie quarterback CJ Stroud is only making $9 million per season, which in comparison to a lot of other quarterbacks is obviously a total steal. As of right now, Joe Burrow and Justin Herbert have the highest contracts, with Joe Burrow making $55 million per year. And when you compare CJ Stroud's $9 million to certain quarterbacks like Russell Wilson or Kyler Murray, it looks pretty damn good. At the end of the day, Russell Wilson and Kyler Murray are making about $46 to $49 million per year, which is almost $40 million more than what CJ Stroud is making. In comparison, CJ Stroud is making a little bit more money than Zach Wilson and Trey Lance. And because CJ Stroud is getting paid so little, the Houston Texans have about $69.9 million in cap space to work with. And with a growing cap space, that number is only going to continue to increase moving forward. Now, with that being said, they do have about 20 plus players they're going to have to potentially re-sign. Not a lot of big name guys, and I'm sure a ton of these guys will actually just go on to free agency, but there are certain players like Sheldon Rankins and Dalton Schultz who you're definitely going to want to bring back. We'll discuss that a little bit more in the future, but I did want to at least mention that they do have about 29 players who are going to be gone or potentially re-signed. So the $69.9 million is obviously going to fluctuate depending on who they bring back. Now, if you've seen any of my videos, you guys know how I feel about the cap space. I think cap space is a number that is pretty easy to fluctuate. You can give guys certain extensions that are good team-friendly deals. You could also cut certain players who are getting paid more than they should, as well as you can also do a lot of restructuring to other contracts to fix your cap space problems. So in all reality, that $69.9 million, if you do the numbers correctly, could probably grow to $80 million plus. And that basically goes for every single team. You see a team like the New Orleans Saints who are negative $80 million in cap space, who continuously are able to re-sign and sign certain players because they're able to fluctuate their cap space pretty easily. So for a team like Houston, they're in a very fun spot where you have $69 million to work with, but you can also grow that number to $80 plus million. So I told you guys earlier about Sheldon Rankins and Dalton Schultz and how I think they should be re-signed, but of the 29 players who are going to be becoming free agents this offseason, I think only a handful of guys, including Dalton Schultz and Sheldon Rankins, should actually be brought back. As it sits right now, the only players that I would have as top priority would be guys like Devin Singletary, Steven Nelson, Jonathan Grenard, George Fant, Derek Barnett, Dalton Schultz, and Sheldon Rankins, which means you'd have a ton of players who wouldn't be brought back, but a lot of these guys are just depth pieces or just borderline starters. And also, I decided to not bring back guys like Denzel Perriman and Jerry Hughes because these are older players on a very young team that is kind of at the end of the rebuild. So sure, you can bring these guys back as depth options, but I think moving forward, you want to sign a lot of younger players who are going to help you in the immediate while also helping you for the next couple seasons. Again, to kind of reiterate things, the Houston Texans are in a tough spot where you want to bring in guys and you want to re-sign guys, but you also have to be kind of picky on who you're going to bring back because, again, you're a younger team that needs to develop. So yes, you would love to go out there and get an older offensive tackle who can help you right now, but that offensive tackle might only help you for 1 or 2 years before he ends up retiring. Like Lane Johnson and Tyron Smith would be amazing adds to this offense for the next couple seasons, but how long do they really have in the league? Maybe 2 years at most? And when your starting quarterback is 23 years old and Tank Dell is however old he is, you're going to want to get somebody who's going to be around for a while. That's why they ultimately brought back guys like Titus Howard and Laramie Tunsil, because they're young enough to stick around for this team for many years to come. And while Titus Howard did have some injuries, I do think coming back in the future, he's going to be a good player for them. So that now brings me on to who I would sign in free agency, and I have a couple names who they should at least take a look at. The names I wrote down are Jalen Johnson, L'Jarius Sneed, Carlton Davis, Connor Williams, Jonah Jackson, Tyler Boyd, Jerry Jeudy, and Josh Uche. Those are just a handful of names. Of course, I didn't include a big name guys like Micah Hyde and T. Higgins because I just don't suspect that a Houston Texans team would be very interested in them. I went for more of a group of guys who are on the younger side, but it can also continue to develop up and help this team out immediately. Of course, you do have some older guys like Carlton Davis and Jonah Jackson, but you kind of get my point. I wanted guys who would fit into this Houston Texans team immediately and help this team become that championship contender while also not taking up too much cap space. So for me, I think these are some guys you should definitely look at. Of course, like I said earlier, T. Higgins, Micah Hyde, so on and so forth. You can definitely look at those guys, but these are just the names that I came up with off the top of my head. If I was Houston, these guys would be very attractive because a lot of these guys are corners, defensive linemen, offensive linemen, or receivers, which are sort of pieces of need for this team. And overall, when you look at the roster, this team doesn't have any glaring needs, but they also have a couple needs they definitely should look to address. For example, on the offensive side of things, the offensive line, running back room, and maybe a true receiver 3 would be a very nice additions for this offense. This was one of the worser offenses at running the football, which definitely does suck when you have guys like Devin Singletary and Damian Pierce. A lot of that has to do with the offensive line not getting pushed, but it also has some things to do with the running backs. And while this draft isn't full of running back studs, I do think a guy like a Bucky Irving or a Jonathan Brooks could definitely be good additions to add to this offense in the 3rd or 4th round if they're available. And at the receiver 3 position, I don't think you really have to go for one in the 1st round, but in the 2nd or 3rd rounds, there's going to be guys like Adonai Mitchell, Xavier Worthy, Xavier Legette, who could definitely come in here and fill in a certain spot if you don't go out there and get a Jerry Jeudy or Tyler Boyd. And then when you look at the offensive line, it's actually a very interesting unit. For starters, as I mentioned earlier, Tytus Howard did miss a bunch of time this year, and so did former 1st round pick Kenyon Green. I would imagine that when those guys get healthy, they're going to get put back instantly into their first team offensive line, which then kind of brings up some interesting questions along the offensive line. For starters, you obviously know that Laramie Tunsil is going to be your starting left tackle no matter what, but then you have some questions on basically every single position. For example, Juice Scruggs was their starting left guard who they took in the 2nd round of last year's draft. And while he didn't play fantastic, I do think there are some good signs moving forward that you would probably want to keep him as your starter to develop him. I don't really know if it's worth wasting his career if he was just a 2nd round pick who has a lot of talent. So I think Juice Scruggs should definitely be in the conversation as well to be a starter next year, which then obviously brings up some questions because, well, Tytus Howard also played guard and I believe was playing the left guard position early on this year, but you also have questions of whether or not Kenyon Green could fill in that left guard spot as well. So I do think there's about 3 options you could potentially do for that left guard position. If it was me, I would probably just keep Juice Scruggs as that left guard moving forward. At your center position, you do have Michael Dieter, and while I think there's some good signs of development there, I would also potentially think about moving Kenyon Green to the center position because I do believe he did play that a little bit at Texas A&M. Then at right guard, you could keep Shaq Mason, and then at right tackle, you can move back Tytus Howard. I think if they do that and it ends up working out like it does in my head, I do think that could be a pretty good offensive line. Would that stop me from taking a top tier offensive line in this year's draft? No. For example, if a J.C. Latham or a Marius Mims are available, I would definitely consider taking one in that spot. This was an offensive line that wasn't necessarily disappointing because they actually performed probably a little bit better than what most people thought they would do, but I think it's a less of a tell of how good the offensive line is and more of a tell of how good CJ Stroud and the system truly are. Again, that's not to take away from the offensive line, that's just to give more credit to where it should actually be due. And then on the defensive side of things, I do think a pass rusher alongside Jonathan Grenard and Will Anderson are definitely a true need. Derek Barnett definitely did show signs, and as I mentioned earlier, I do think he should be brought back for this team, but I think getting a truly just fantastic pass rusher in the draft could definitely be a legit option for them. For an example, I think Braylon Trice would be a very good player to add along the defensive line, so if he is available, I do think that should definitely be an option for them. Moving on, I think the linebacker position should be something they look to address as well. Blake Cashman and Christian Harris definitely had some good moments, and I think Blake Cashman moving forward will be their starting linebacker, but a guy in Denzel Perriman is going to have to get replaced. He's obviously older, and at this point of his career is not very good in coverage. I don't think there's any first round linebackers you're going to be wanting to take, so I do think for agency you should be looking at the linebacker position. Next up is the secondary, and when you look at the secondary, it's one of the more older units out there. Steven Nelson, Desmond King, Kareem Jackson, and Adrian Amos have been in the league for quite some time, and that's not even mentioning Jimmy Ward, who's currently on IR. Yes, they have guys like Jalen Petrie and DeAndre Houston Carson and Derek Stingley Jr., who I do think moving forward will be key pieces for the secondary, but I do think the cornerback position and potentially the safety position should be positions of desperate need in this current offseason. Again, I mentioned guys like Jalen Johnson, L'Jarius Steed, and Carlton Davis, but I do think a guy like a Kenny Moore could also fill in a good spot for this team as well. And I think in the first round, if a guy like a Nate Wiggins, a Kool-Aid McKinstry, or a Terran Arnold are available with that spot, I definitely would consider taking them. So when it comes to the draft, I'm only going to talk about the first 2 rounds because I haven't done enough deep dive in this year's draft to talk about the 3rd or 4th rounds. If it was me, with my first round pick, I would take either a cornerback, an edge rusher, or an offensive lineman, depending on who was available. I think the best names to fill in those positions would be a guy like a Nate Wiggins, Kool-Aid McKinstry, Terrion Arnold, maybe a J.C. Latham, a Braylon Trice, and lastly, a guy like Jared Verse would also be very nice for this unit. With your 2nd round pick, you can either go cornerback, edge rusher, offensive lineman, maybe a receiver, or maybe a linebacker, depending on who's available. Obviously, if you do take a cornerback in round 1, you're probably not going to take one in round 2. Same thing with offensive line, edge rusher, and even receiver if they do decide to go down that route. As for who could be available and who I would like to see this team go out there and get, I do think a guy like a Chris Braswell, maybe an Xavier Worthy, an Adonai Mitchell. They could even go for a guy like a Jeremiah Trotter. And the last name I'll throw out there is Chop Robinson, the edge rusher for Penn State. I think if you were to go out there and do that in this year's draft, I think that would be an absolute home run of some draft picks. I think if this was hypothetical, the best case scenario for this team would be in their first round to get a guy like a Nate Wiggins to add to the secondary, and in the second round to get a guy like a Chop Robinson to add a truly good pass rusher alongside Will Anderson. Again, we're being hypothetical here, and I don't think that's what's going to happen, but if they can get those 2 guys, I think that would be a very nice draft. So to kind of put a bow on things, listen, if you're a Houston Texans fan, there's a lot to be happy about with your team. You obviously have some really good young players in Tank Dell, Will Anderson, and of course CJ Stroud. But these guys are helping you contend now. They obviously showed a ton of poise against Houston, and they did a really good job of fighting against that Baltimore Ravens team for a lot of the game. I do feel as if this team has a legitimate chance to contend for championships very soon. This is sort of a now or never situation because once CJ Stroud gets paid, it makes it a lot harder to truly compete for championships. Ask guys like the Dallas Cowboys and the Cincinnati Bengals who recently had to pay their star quarterbacks, and look how it's going for them. You got to capitalize on the contract situation that you are in with CJ Stroud, because if not, it's going to get bad and it's going to be a lot harder to truly compete, especially when you're in the AFC with Patrick Mahomes, Justin Herbert, Josh Allen, Joe Burrow, so on and so forth. So for Houston, I wish you luck, and Houston Texans fans, you guys tell me in the comment section below what you guys think, but I love you guys. Peace.